So, when dealing with almost any herb within witchcraft or any kind of magical practicing, there's a couple things to be wary of. Things with a similar name or a kind of vaguely similar purpose often get misidentified as each other. Now, I would say that this most happens to me personally when trying to find one of these three different things called nettle. I personally use a lot of purple dead nettle, and a lot of what I'm looking at actually seems to be either henbit, which is a very similar plant that is found alongside purple dead nettle, though rarely and somewhat suspiciously, what I'm actually looking at is stinging nettle. Now, there's a couple obvious ways to tell the difference here, but they all exist in similar environments. Now, one of the main things to know is that stinging nettle is what is referred to as a true nettle. Henbit nettle and purple dead nettle are actually within the mint family. So another relatively easy way to tell, at the very least in plant form, is that these two are going to have slightly weaker and square stems, while stinging nettle has round shape. And you also might be able to see, like, obviously, these are pointier and so forth compared to these. These are really good photos of these plants in mature form. Though obviously, when identifying any nettle to stinging nettle, they'll literally sting. They're going to have like these little hairs that are irritating. But all of these plants are, in general, a form of protection, but they're all subtly different in the way that they do it. Stinging nettle is more like porcupine protection. It is there to create and reinforce boundaries. Henbit is more for, consolidating and being resilient, and it's very much usually your energetic and emotional protection, while purple dead nettle is more associated with protecting those things against outside influences. Subtle difference, but still a difference that can be very important, in relation to a working. And these subtle differences can be seen throughout the various cultures that you'll find these in. Stinging nettle was often, hung on boundaries. It was even used in clumps to throw in a campfire as a sacrifice to Thor. Henbit is seen as really associated with, the She and the other Fae of the Celtic areas. And purple dead nettle in general kind of seen more as something that, kind of wards off specifically spirits. And especially because these two are going to be most commonly misidentified as each other and they're often found together, um, all of these in general are considered weeds, and therefore they also have associations with like resiliency and thriving, especially because they all can basically survive in even the most abominable soil. But identification, especially if you are for some reason foraging them before their most mature form, because even in their most mature form, their general shapes are enough like each other that, at least at a cursory glance, you might not realize the distinction, which gets really important, especially because henbit and purple dead nettle are used as like inflammatory teas, which, while has worked for me, is something you should discuss with your doctor before, foraging and just doing it yourself. But such teas are going to have a very different effect if you use this. But the subtle differences of their spiritual usages is important enough, outside of, we'll say, like, just generally doing it for protection, that it's definitely one of those things to bring forward, and this is one of the easiest examples to talk about when it comes to, you know, if you're looking for nettle for this kind of working, be sure you're getting the nettle. Especially because the nettle naming family, as opposed to true nettles and mints, create the differentiation. But even the most subtle differences between henbit and purple nettle, are important, even if confusing those two aren't necessarily dangerous. But I have seen both plants and basically like little bundle bags of these two either confused for or are actually this. But it's something to be mindful of, especially because in a lot of folk traditions, putting the leaves of these two in pouches is a protective thing. And while this one is also protective, you're going to get a rash from it. Basically, TLDR, when it comes to protection, Stinging Nettle is the sword, Henbit is the armor, and Purple Dead Nettle is the shield. It's a relatively simple thing to be mindful of because even if you're just doing a general protective working, and any of these would do, the fact that these cover different forms of protection could be important.